For the sake of time, I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one. Today, 40% of the world's population is living in slums. These slums are unsanitary, they exacerbate socioeconomic disparities. About almost a billion urban dwellers lack adequate sanitation in living areas, in urban areas. In sub-Saharan South Asia, the problem's even more acute. Almost 50% of the population is living in slums, thousands of people dying every day of cholera, typhoid, and like all of these diseases, right? Other than that, we have like huge economic inequity and disparity existing in these cities. And that's something that will be the main focus of what we'll be talking about, right? Um, I also want to point out, like, remember COVID-19 waves in India, where thousands of immigrants worker walked home thousands of miles because they preferred uh, this like rigorous sort of like pilgrimage over like dying of starvation in those scenarios, right? Because most of the time, like even without like basic access at the point where like most people in the cities could comfortably live in, they were put forth in such a scenario that it was impossible to survive. In fact, these are conditions that they regularly face, but like it was exacerbated to such a level that they couldn't survive anymore, right? Understand that these people come to accept it as the norm. These like sort of poverty, they take it as the cost of getting out of poverty, and they believe that they deserve to be treated like this. We believe this is principally wrong in our debate, right? Like, despite the outcome, we think it's principally important to note that urbanization doesn't help reduce inequity between people, right? So before we go and like look at like why that happens, it's also important to understand why do people urbanize, right? This particularly two reasons, right? Like urbanization happens because people migrate from rural areas to cities, mostly for two reasons: prospect of greater employment and better life. Understand both of these situations can oftentimes be systemic, where, for example, your government's only focusing on developing your cities rather than like provide a national sort of infrastructure, make things better for people in rural areas, as well as better life. Again, something that could be systemic depending on like how states run their policies, right? But understand that these people, when they move, they are expected to create greater economic value than they do in rural areas. The process of absorption into these sort of like areas is not smooth. There's like the high cost of living and standards, which is created by like high population density, that traps these people in constant poverty. They're unwilling to move out because of the opportunity cost. And again, because they understand that this is a cost of us moving here, making better life for our children, and so on, right? Like it's made as a facade of a dream that they try to live through. They're unwilling to move out in those regards unless driven to the point of starvation, as we saw in COVID-19 crisis, right? Understand the development of city level institutions often thwart progress in rural areas and national standard of growth, right? Understand it's mostly because states often at times are only focused on the GDP. Even when they're investing, they tend to invest in cities, most likely because connecting, say, like major cities is more likely to improve jobs in these areas. Urbanization will happen. That will give you a relative economic growth. That will give you institutions through which you can compete with other states. It makes your nation look good, but it's problematic because cities are limited and people cannot always move in, right? So what do we mean by like in terms of model? Our model is not very like specific. We essentially talk about any policies that tends to disincentivize urban migration, whether it's protection of like urban development in areas around the cities so as to like not lead to the expansion, whether it's creation of more jobs in rural areas, having better transportation connection, like even like positive sort of policies that affect like rural areas that will prevent people from like urbanizing, right? As well as like better connection between these places, right? Any policy that tends to reduce people from moving into these particular areas, we think that's important. We think often at times that has to be done in order to like, because of limited resource problem, right? Why do these people suffer so much in the status quo, right? Understand that socio-economic situation of the urban poor also has effects on rural poor, right? Understand just because like states keep investing in like their rural areas, what ends up happening is often at times like most of the rural areas don't have that limited opportunity. With given rise of inflation, with given debt traps often like created by like urban sort of like financial institutions that these people suffer from, they realize that the only way they can get institutions that they see, whether through media, whether like good schools, is to move to the cities. Often at times it's because like the amenities provided to these places is substandard. Often at times like states are not willing to invest in large term electricity, large term power, better sort of like institutions like schools and access to like better healthcare. Then often at times people realize that the only way they have to survive and have their kids like get a better life, get better education, is to move to these sort of places. We think that form of substandard provision often at times is due to negligence of governments. We think that's why economic policies should focus on the rural areas rather than the urban areas, right? Because it often brings about social instability. You look at cities, for example, often at times getting more people into cities leads to crises like water supply. It leads to crises like sewage. Often at times understand that most states, most developing countries don't have a proper form of sewage like the United States does. Often understand that most of these cities don't even have better like good form of like transportation, like roads. Like you look at Bangalore, for example, which is one of the most urban cities in India, and the road system is so sad that like even if you're rich, even if you have a car, it takes 2 hours to get around from like travel distance often at times 10 to 12 kilometers. So understand like these problems will continue to exacerbate. In principle, it's important for states to go around and instead focus on like providing policies in rural areas, like getting rid of the negligence and protecting people from these scenarios, because given the status quo, they're very likely to move in and they're likely to suffer debt trap. And this is all the fault of the state. Very proud to propose.